Hello and welcome to this online lecture. My name is Krishnan Ram-Prasad, and today we'll be taking a look at relative clauses in Proto-Indo-European. Before starting, I'll just give a brief overview of what we'll be looking at today. We'll start by having a brief introduction/reminder of what relative clauses are and how they work in some of the Indo-European daughter languages. We'll then move on to discussing the different types of relative clause in a bit more detail and how they compare across the daughter languages, before moving on to some questions about reconstruction. You may have spotted this lovely picture of the Dipylon vase on the right, which happens to be one of the earliest Greek alphabetic inscriptions. But that's not all. As you may also have spotted, the Dipylon vase gives us a glorious example of an early Greek relative clause in the wild. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I promised a little bit of background on relative clauses before we dived in. You may have been taught relative clauses formally at some point and forgotten, and you may never have paid much attention to them at all, but you will certainly recognise them when you see them. A relative clause is a type of subordinate clause. Relative clauses generally modify or describe a nominal phrase that appears in the main sentence. This nominal phrase is traditionally referred to as the antecedent. Let's have a look at an example. Someone who I trusted to follow me on my personal Instagram account has been consistently informing the Sun newspaper of my private posts and stories. The relative clause here is in bold. The antecedent in this case is someone, and the relative clause gives us a bit more information about that someone, namely that they were trusted to follow the speaker's personal Instagram account. Your attention may have been drawn to the word who here, since it's underlined. This is the relative pronoun, and they are used to introduce relative clauses. Here is another example. I have saved and screenshotted all the original stories which clearly show just one person has viewed them. In English, there are a few different forms of the relative pronoun, namely who, which, whose, and whom, if you insist. I personally have to agree with Colleen Rooney in that first example that we don't really need whom anymore, but I have no doubts that some of you are going to disagree. Which form of the relative pronoun we use, in any case, depends on the antecedent, and we'll see more of this presently. Anyway, now we know what type of clause we're dealing with, let's take a look at some of the data from the daughter languages, starting with Latin. In Latin, your relative pronoun is qui, quae, quod, which comes from the Proto-Indo-European qui or qua. I'll treat these as basically the same throughout this lecture. And it agrees with the antecedent in number and gender. To take an example, est in Britannia flumen quod appellatur Tamesis. So, in this example, the antecedent is flumen, the river. It's a neuter singular noun, so we get the corresponding form of the relative pronoun, quod. The other morphological feature we have to pay attention to is obviously case, but note that unlike number and gender, which are determined solely by the antecedent, the case of the relative pronoun is determined by its grammatical function in the relative clause. Quis est cui non possit malum evenire. In this example, the antecedent is quis, who, with a question mark, which is in the nominative. But the relative pronoun, cui, is in the dative. That's because the verb evenire, meaning to happen, takes the dative of the person something is happening to, just like in English. And I've resurrected whom in my translation just to try and demonstrate this. Turning now to ancient Greek, we see the situation is basically the same. We have the relative pronoun, in this case hos, her, ho, which comes from Proto-Indo-European yo, and it agrees in number and gender with the antecedent, just like in Latin. Eim Odysseus laertiades, hos pasi doloisin anthropoisi melo. Here, the antecedent, Odysseus, is masculine singular, so we get hos for the relative pronoun. Case is a bit more complicated in Greek than in Latin, because although it's generally decided by the relative pronoun's function in the relative clause, it sometimes gets attracted to the case of its antecedent. Here is a classic example. Hopos un esesthe andres axioites eleutherias hes kektesthe. Here, the verb kektesthe, which means you have obtained, should take the accusative for its direct object, hen. But we get the genitive form of the relative pronoun, hes, because the antecedent eleutherias is in the genitive. But case attraction of this sort is optional, and most of the time Latin and Greek work in the same way. Of course, one glaring difference between them is the form of the relative pronoun itself. Which one of them is the original? Is it qui, quo, or ya? We'll discuss this later on. But now let's have a look at the semantics of relative clauses. They can generally be divided into two types: restrictive relative clauses and non-restrictive relative clauses, sometimes called appositive relative clauses. Restrictive relative clauses are so called because they restrict the set of reference denoted by the antecedent. That's a lot of words to say something pretty simple. Take this example from the Iliad. Antinu polon laon estin aner hontes deus keri philesei. Here, the antecedent is aner, which means the man. So let's say that antecedent denotes the set of men. The relative clause, hontes deus keri philesei, tells us that this is the man whom Zeus loves in his heart. This restricts the set of entities by adding another condition, namely that they are loved by Zeus. Now the intersection of these gives us the set men whom Zeus loves in his heart. There is more than one entity that belongs to this set. In fact, Agamemnon is offering us some sort of proverb here, but it becomes obvious in subsequent lines that he's talking about Achilles, here immortalised by Brad Pitt in the infamous 2004 production Troy. On the other hand, non-restrictive relative clauses do not restrict the set of entities denoted by the antecedent, because the antecedent has already selected a unique entity. Again, an example will help us. This time we'll use Sanskrit, which, like Greek, has a relative pronoun descended from Proto-Indo-European ya. Ya esha gopta pratapan balastho, yo nahsenam simha ivekchatecha, sa esha bhishma kurvam shaketur, yena hritas trimshato vajimedhaha. Here, we have no fewer than 3 relative clauses that all describe one man, Bhishma. Bhishma is a pretty prominent character in the Mahabharata, but if you had any doubts, he even comes with his own demonstrative pronoun here, esha, meaning that. So, to play the Venn diagram game again, we start with esha Bhishma, and that gives us this set. But there's only one entity in this set, and that's the one and only Bhishma, played here by Arav Chowdhury in the 2013 series Mahabharata. Each time we add one of our relative clauses, they simply draw concentric circles around him. There is no restriction happening here. A small point that I'll make only briefly is that you may have noticed we make a distinction between non-restrictive and restrictive relative clauses in English. Here is basically the same sentence twice. The top version is restrictive, the linguist who studies relative clauses, or the linguist that studies relative clauses. The second version is non-restrictive and requires an intonational gap. The linguist who studies relative clauses. We also can't use the relative complementizer that for the non-restrictive version. We can't say the linguist that studies relative clauses. Doesn't really work. I won't dwell too much on these specific differences, as English is not our focus and these patterns are by no means universal, but just in case any of the above was unclear, you can always refer back to this slide to remind yourself which one is which. Setting aside these semantic types, there are also different syntactic types of relative clause. One of these we've already seen, and I'm going to call this type plain relative clauses. They're sometimes called European-style relative clauses because of how common they are in modern European languages like English, but I prefer a more neutral term. Other syntactic types of relative clause are also available, such as correlative clauses. As you can see from this example, correlatives are possible in English, but they're not the most usual way of forming relative clauses. However, they are very common in the more ancient Indo-European languages, so let's break them down. So far, we've focused on the form of the relative pronoun. Correlatives are characterized by their use of a corresponding second pronoun, called, you guessed it, the correlative pronoun. The correlative pronoun doesn't have a special form, it's usually just a plain demonstrative or personal pronoun, as in the following example, for which we have Plautus to thank. Ex malis multis malum quod minimumst, id minim est malum. In this example, we see the relative pronoun, now familiar to us, quod, but we also see a correlative pronoun, id, which is a demonstrative. I've translated it here as that. Here is another example, this time from ancient Greek. Tu to de toi ereo, ho maneirai de metallais. This is basically the same situation as Latin. We have our relative pronoun, ho, and a correlative, tuto. Again, the correlative pronoun is a demonstrative, this time translated as this. The only structural difference between these two is that in the Latin example, the relative clause precedes the main clause, but in the Greek example, the relative clause follows the main clause. This is a point of interest I will return to later. A key feature of correlative clauses is that the main clause, which contains the correlative pronoun, can stand alone without the relative clause. In other words, nothing is missing grammatically if we delete the relative clause. Let's look back at these examples. With the relative clause deleted, the main clause still works just fine. That is the least an evil. We might not know what that is, but the sentence is grammatical. Similarly, I will tell you this makes perfect sense. But if we play the same game with a plain relative, things go awry. I've converted my translation of the Latin example into a plain relative form, and you can see how odd it sounds to say, is the least an evil. To put it simply, in correlative structures there is a greater degree of independence between the two clauses than with plain relatives. This is another point that will become key later on. In terms of the distribution of correlative clauses, they are found across the ancient Indo-European languages, but are particularly prominent in Sanskrit. They are attested in the earliest layers of the language, generally referred to as Vedic, but become a standard relativization strategy in classical Sanskrit, such as in the following example from the Bhagavad Gita, composed around 1,000 years after the earliest Vedic texts. Yo mam pashyati sarvatra sarvam chamai pashyati, tasyaham na pranashyami sachame na pranashyati. In fact, if we fast forward another couple of thousand years, we see correlative structures alive and well in modern Indo-Aryan languages, such as Hindi. Jo aadmi lamba hai, wo mera bhai hai. The examples I have given so far have made the distinction between plain relatives and correlatives as clear as possible. However, it is not always easy to tell the difference. Take the following Vedic example, commented upon by Alice Davison in her 2009 paper. You'll find a link to the bibliography at the end of the lecture. Namrasha shrantam yad avanti devaha. This analysis is a bit technical, so I'm going to break it down for you. Here's the gloss. At first, this may look like a plain relative, and that's perfectly possible. In this case, the plain relative clause, yad avanti devaha, which the gods favour, simply describes the subject, shrantam, exertion. So the whole subject is the exertion which the gods favour, and the predicate, if you find this term helpful, is namrasha, is not in vain. Remember, we don't always need a verb for to be in Sanskrit. And that's actually quite relevant here, because a feature of these ancient Indo-European languages is that often words can be omitted. So it is entirely possible from a structural point of view that this sentence is in fact a correlative, just missing the correlative pronoun. If we put it back in, and repeat shrantam for clarity, we get this. Na mrsha tat shrantam, that exertion is not in vain. And then, yat shrantam avanti devaha, which exertion the gods favour. Here we have two subjects and two predicates. The first subject is tam shrantam, that exertion, and its predicate is namrasha, is not in vain. Then we introduce another subject, devaha, the gods, and another predicate, yad shrantam avanti, they favour which exertion. Now don't worry if that's left your head in a spin. The basic point here is that we can either take this example as one syntactic unit containing a plain relative clause describing the antecedent, or as essentially two syntactic units, one containing a relative clause and one containing a correlative clause, or the main clause. This kind of confusion may well be what led other languages to pick one or the other as their main relativization strategy. So, with all this information in mind, we can come up with 3 key questions we need to answer with our reconstruction. 1. Was the relative pronoun in Proto-Indo-European qua or ya, or both? 2. Did PIE have plain relative clauses or correlative clauses, or both? And 3. Did relative clauses precede or follow the main clause, or both? Without further ado then, let's have a look at that first question. We've already got some sense of the distribution of qua versus ya in the daughter languages, but it's worth mentioning it in a little bit more detail here. The ya languages include Greek, Indo-Iranian languages, Phrygian and Celtic, while the qua languages include Latin, Sabellic, Hittite, Tocharian, Albanian and Lithuanian. Apologies if you don't see your favourite language family here. It's probably because either the situation is a little unclear, like in Armenian, or because that language family innovated its own form of relativization that doesn't use either of those pronouns, RIP Germanic. A point that is often made is that the ya languages appear to be broadly archaic, whereas the qua languages tend to be newer, all appearing in the Common Era, except Latin, the Sabellic languages, and Hittite. For me, these exceptions are a little too notable for this observation to be valid. In fact, the last of these, Hittite, is actually the oldest attested Indo-European language. On the other hand, people have also suggested that ya might characterise more central Indo-European languages, whereas qua appears on the periphery. Depending on your opinion on the fiercely disputed migration patterns of the Indo-Europeans, this isn't impossible, but even from an entirely impressionistic point of view, displayed on my entirely unscientific map, I think you'd be hard-pressed to identify a clear geographic pattern here. So, we can't really resolve this question by age or region, but there are other patterns of a more linguistic nature that can help us. I'll take you through them now, but be sure to check out the bibliography, which gives you a summary of what different authors think. An observation that has guided many authors' work is the fact that the reflexes of Proto-Indo-European ya surface only really as relative pronouns, whereas qua is all but guaranteed to be the ancestor of the interrogative pronouns and often the indefinite pronouns. So I'm afraid you've got 2 more types of pronoun to bear in mind, but hopefully you can see what each one does from this table. The interrogative pronoun asks the questions, the indefinite pronoun gives you the something, someone, anything, anyone meaning. As you can see, in the qua languages you get basically the same form of the pronoun for all 3 uses with some minor additions. In the ya languages, we still have qua for the interrogative and indefinite pronouns, but we have ya for the relatives. Fun fact, modern English almost looks like a qua language since we have who, which, etc., which are historically traced back to qua as both our relative and interrogative pronouns. Nevertheless, it's only in the last millennium that this actually happened, way after the time period we're interested in, and that's why English always gets benched in this discussion. Anyway, we can schematise the information in the table on the previous slide into the following templates. The top one gives us our ya languages, and the bottom one, the qua languages. A potential solution to the ya versus qua question is if we assume that the ya system was the original. In this circumstance, qua was only used for interrogative and indefinite pronouns, but not the relative. We can then explain the pattern seen in the qua languages if we say that the interrogative pronoun, qua, supplanted the original relative pronoun, ya. This is in fact a well-established grammaticalization pathway. For example, it seems to be what happened in English, as I mentioned earlier. And if you're interested in why it's the interrogative specifically rather than the indefinite pronoun, I'd point you to the work of Eugen Uluchan, who you can find in the bibliography. This model does look good, and it is a potential solution to the ya versus qua question. However, and there is always a however, there are some problems. I've said we don't want to revert too much to age, but Hittite is really old, attested several hundred years before any of the other Indo-European languages. And since its decipherment in the 1930s, Hittite has thrown up several questions that made us challenge our traditional assumptions about Proto-Indo-European. because for it to have branched off and innovated so quickly doesn't always sit well with us, and we should always take a moment to consider whether Hittite reflects the earlier form, while the so-called nuclear Indo-European languages show the innovation. But in this case, even if we do accept Hittite has undergone some form of innovation here, it seems to be shared with, among others, Latin. There's no special genetic link between these languages, so for them to have shared this innovation, it must have happened independently in each language and quickly. Again, this is not impossible, we know this change is common, but this is exactly the kind of complication we aim to avoid when we do reconstruction. So, what might an alternative to this hypothesis look like? Well, several authors have argued that in fact both ya and qua were used as relative pronouns in Proto-Indo-European, but in different situations, namely in restrictive versus non-restrictive clauses. This hypothesis is based on the observation that if we take Latin and Hittite, our best attested ancient qua languages, and look at their earliest texts, we see that relative clauses tend to be restrictive. On the other hand, if we look at the earliest texts of Sanskrit and Greek, our ya languages, the relative clauses tend to be non-restrictive. So if we join the dots here, we might suggest that qua was the relative pronoun for restrictive relative clauses, while ya was used for non-restrictive relative clauses. However, you must be getting used to this now, there are still problems. We need to look at the nature of the earliest texts in each language. If we look at Latin and Hittite, we see that the earliest attestations are inscriptions that are generally legal in nature. For Greek and Sanskrit, however, our earliest large-scale attestations are from oral poetry. The apparent imbalance between restrictive and non-restrictive relative clauses, therefore, is likely to be one of genre more than anything else. In legal texts, where it is important to establish things like who gave what money and who owns what land, we expect there to be a higher density of restrictive relative clauses. In poetry, where we get lavish descriptions of places and people, like the one we saw earlier, we would perhaps expect a greater number of non-restrictive relative clauses. And if that's the case, then there is no meaningful reconstructible pattern for ya versus qua when it comes to restrictive versus non-restrictive relative clauses. Incidentally, I have so far excluded Mycenaean from my generalizations about Greek because it's a pretty small corpus and there are still some questions surrounding our interpretation, though you should definitely check out Philemon Probert's work in the bibliography if you want to know more. But long story short, Mycenaean causes even more problems for this hypothesis because A, it's attested earlier than the Homeric poems, B, the texts are very much not poetic, and C, we don't really seem to find any non-restrictive relative clauses. So in fact, Mycenaean Greek, the earliest attested Greek, looks more like Hittite and Latin in terms of its use of restrictive relative clauses, but it uses ya. So the qua versus ya question remains very much unsolved. So let's do what all good historical linguists do and move on to another unsolved, but hopefully not unsolvable question, that of plain relatives versus correlatives. Now, in terms of their distribution, as I've already mentioned, we see correlatives all over the place in the daughter languages, and they are attested at an early stage in basically every branch. However, none of the daughter languages have correlative clauses obligatorily. That is to say, plain relatives always appear to be available. So a major question is how correlatives and plain relatives might be linked, if they are linked. Some scholars have suggested that correlatives are actually the original strategy for relativization and subsequently developed into plain relatives by reanalysis of ambiguous structures like the one we saw in Sanskrit. Much of the justification for this hypothesis comes from the notion that correlative structures are paratactic, whereas plain relatives are hypertactic structures. Parataxis is basically where we put sentences or clauses side by side. So, if we take a look at an example that looks horrendously unnatural in English, but is more or less a direct gloss of the structures we see in the ancient languages, we get basically two syntactic units. Which linguist studies relative clauses? And they know me. I've used brackets to help demonstrate this. Even if there is some sort of semantic or pragmatic or even syntactic dependency between the two, They are, at the very least, side by side in a linear sense. That's parataxis. Hypertaxis is when, instead of putting two clauses side by side, we put one inside the other. If we look at the plain relative version of this sentence, you can see that the relative clause is actually embedded within the main clause. That's hypertaxis. Now, in some intuitive sense, we might think that as time goes on, paratactic structures, where elements appear next to each other, sort of fuse together into hypertactic structures. Part of why we might think that is because paratactic structures are thought of as somehow more basic, and hypertactic structures are more complex. Perhaps we think this because parataxis gives us nice, short, conversational sentences. For example, who thinks this? I want to speak to them. Whereas hypertaxis is a bit more involved, a bit more complex, a bit less discursive. I want to speak to the person who thinks this. But I have to say, I don't buy this at all. I'm going to rein myself in from a rant about how we still don't even know where to begin when it comes to measuring grammatical complexity, and how the distinction between parataxis and hypertaxis really falls apart in the face of contemporary developments in syntactic theory. So I will limit myself to two very conservative reasons why this theory should be dispreferred. Firstly, even if we accept the premise of basic versus complex structures, we really don't want to posit a stage of Proto-Indo-European where hypertaxis, the complex structure, doesn't exist. In doing so, we would end up effectively concluding that Proto-Indo-European was a more primitive language than the daughter languages. If we do this, we flout the uniformitarian hypothesis. The uniformitarian hypothesis is a term borrowed from the natural scientists, where we must assume that the laws of physics, as we can observe them today, must have applied in the same way in the past. If we abandon this notion, we become unable to draw any scientific conclusions about things that happened before us. The linguistic version of this is to say that we must assume the general observations about language, with a capital L, as we can observe them today, must always have operated in the past. In other words, once we start positing a language in the past that doesn't follow the rules of language in the present, such as the availability of hypertaxis, we quickly fall into the trap of saying potentially any old nonsense and justifying it simply by saying, oh well, the proto-language was more primitive than the attested languages. I really think we've got to avoid this at all costs. And the second problem, which sort of follows from the first but relies solely on a dutiful application of the comparative method, is that all things being equal, where we have identity in the daughter languages, that is to say, when they all show the same thing, we reconstruct that thing into the proto-language. It's almost rule number one of reconstruction. For instance, even though they may disagree on the exact forms, all of the daughter languages show verbal morphology of some kind, and so we reconstruct it into the proto-language. Since plain relatives exist in all the daughter languages, if we don't reconstruct them into the proto-language, we've sort of thrown our own rule in the bin, and that's also something we want to avoid. I have tried to be pretty even-handed in my treatment of the different theories so far, but I feel like these problems are actually pretty big. So what can we actually say in the face of them? Well, we can say that correlatives, and parataxis more generally, if we stick with it as an idea, were almost certainly a method of relativization in early Proto-Indo-European, and some types of plain relatives can be derived from correlative structures. But the exact nature of the relationship between plain relatives and correlatives remains a mystery, one I've spent some years trying to solve, and I may spend some more years investigating. But for now, let's take a look at that final question. Now, I tried to come up with some awful linguistic dad joke about RCMC being a pretty good name for a philology-themed rock band, but I could literally hear it going down like a sack of nails through the internet, so I gave up. But I should say that in the following slides, RC stands for relative clause and MC stands for main clause. In the examples we've seen so far, sometimes the relative clause comes before the main clause and sometimes after. Yet again, there appears to be a non-trivial pattern here. For a start, let's take those patterns we already established with qua versus ya and restrictive versus non-restrictive. We can actually add another row here. Lo and behold, In early Hittite and Latin, with their quat relatives that are mainly restrictive, there is also a tendency for the relative clause to precede the main clause. In our Yacht languages, with their preponderance of non-restrictive relative clauses, we see that the main clause tends to come first and the relative clause follows it. But that's not all. Let's take that bottom corner of the table and blow it up. If we put it on its own, we actually describe another pattern, a pattern within a pattern if you like, which is to say, even when we look within specific languages, there is a general trend for restrictive relative clauses to precede the main clause, and trend for non-restrictive relative clauses to follow the main clause. So, even if we take quat versus yacht out of the equation, there seems to be a pattern here. Restrictive implies RC-MC, and non-restrictive implies MC-RC. I would add the caveat at this point, however, that some of our corpora are starting to look pretty small, especially for Old Latin. We also have to be very selective. Once we start looking at other Indo-European languages across a variety of families, there is an overall preference for the main clause to come first and the relative clause to follow it. So our observations about the order of the main clause and the relative clause are not necessarily the most significant. Though to some extent that's true of a lot of the observations we've made so far, and it is sort of an occupational hazard when you're working on these languages. Anyway, the time has come for me to sum it all up for you. Read in a certain way, the data might suggest that we should reconstruct two different types of relative clause in Proto-Indo-European, the quat type and the yacht type, both of which seem to be available as either plain relatives or correlatives. In terms of where they are attested, they can be divided along linguistic lines. Here are the main exponents, but at this point you're obviously aware the distribution goes a lot further than these four languages. Additionally, it looks like the quat type tended to be restrictive and the yacht type tended to be non-restrictive. And finally, each appears to be associated with a specific word order. Qua relative clauses tend to precede the main clause, while yacht relative clauses follow the main clause. As we head further down this table, things become more and more debatable, and different scholars have different views on which, if any, of these hypotheses are viable. I'm not going to give you my final judgment here, not least because I don't really have one. But what I will leave you with today are four central questions that I think further research should seek to answer. Number 1. How many of these apparent patterns can be reduced to just genre? Number 2. How confident are we that quat was originally a relative pronoun at all? Remember all its other uses as an interrogative, as an indefinite? Number 3. Given that all the daughter languages use only one morpheme as a relative pronoun, what makes us think that Proto-Indo-European should have both as relative pronouns? This takes us back into the more methodological question of what constraints there should be on our reconstruction. And then question 4, which is probably the most speculative one. If we do accept correlatives as the genesis of plain relatives, and correlatives were originally paratactic, but we don't want to assume hypertaxis was impossible in Proto-Indo-European, what was the original hypertactic relative structure? Is it something maybe reconstructible like participles, or is it a construction that was so comprehensively replaced that we will never know its true form? Basically, if you take anything away from this lecture, it should be that there are a whole load of questions still to be answered about relative clauses in Proto-Indo-European. And I can only hope, since you made it through 34 minutes of this lecture, that you're as excited as I am about finding some answers. Thanks very much for watching. I feel like I should say like and subscribe or something, but I don't actually have any other content to promote. But you should definitely check out the bibliography. You can access it through my website, but I very helpfully made you a tiny URL there. If you go to tinyurl.com/relative clauses KRP, that's me, then you should be able to access both the permalink for this video and for the bibliography. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. You can reach all of my details through my website. I look forward to hearing from you. Bye-bye for now.